I'm Gintautas Dumcius, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, we're taping a special live edition inside Boston's West End Museum. We'll be talking about ballot questions which for decades have had an impact on policy on and off Beacon Hill, whether it's earned sick time or marijuana legalization, to name a few. Check out a separate segment from our sister podcast, The Horse Race, on the nitty-gritty of the current ballot questions that voters will be deciding this fall. But first, a look from the campaign side. I'm thrilled to be joined by two veterans of the ballot question wars, Lynda Tocci, principal in Dewey Square Group's Boston office, who has worked for candidates and on ballot campaigns across the country, including here, New Hampshire, Iowa, and Florida. We're also joined by Conor Yunits, executive vice president at Issues Management Group, who has advised candidates up and down the ballot as well as statewide ballot questions. Lynda and Conor, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.
I'd like to start out by asking both of you to briefly list some of the ballot questions you've worked on, and then I'll get to the follow-up there. So, Lynda, if you want to go first.
So I was trying to remember all of them, and it's kind of hard. You always remember your victories, and sometimes you forget the ones that you have the opportunity to learn a lot on along the way. I think I started in this effort working on an SEIU ballot question. I think it was 2006 or 2008. But I began my career in Iowa in 1990 working on the last state ERA ballot question campaign in Iowa. And that's kind of where I started in politics. And then got back to the ballot questions in the mid-2000s. But the ones that I worked on most recently that I think people would remember certainly were the medical marijuana ballot question in 2012, the charter school ballot question in 2016. I see some friends in the room that we worked collectively together on that. 2018 nurse staffing, and then in 2020 worked on some ballot questions, and this year I have the psychedelics ballot question, which is question number 4.
Conor?
I have had the great pleasure to work with Lynda on a couple of those questions, including nurse staffing in 2018, and now question 4. I also worked on question 1 in 2020, which was right to repair part 2. I worked with the automakers, and for 4 years, I worked with Uber and Lyft on the ballot question that never was, the classification of rideshare in delivery drivers as independent contractors, which is, I'm sure everyone in this room knows, was settled between the companies and the Attorney General at the end of June of this year. So didn't go to the ballot in 2022 because of the SJC, didn't go to the ballot in 2024 because of the settlement with the AG, and so worked on a ballot question for 4 years and never actually made it to the ballot.
And Conor, I want to stick with you and ask, do you have a favorite or a challenging or an interesting ballot question that kind of stood out to you?
Is the questions themselves? I mean, I think they're all interesting in their own way. I will say that the rideshare one, I think because I did it for so long, it became like a passion project. I mean, I just talked about rideshare drivers every day for 4 years, and so that one definitely sticks with me. I will say that there was nothing like the feeling of defeating question 1 in 2018 on the nurse staffing side, because the polling had been so bad for us all through the summer, and then to win that one, that was a really fun election night victory.
And I was sort of remiss in not talking about rideshare. Yes, and we were both a part of that together. I think for me, the ballot questions I tend to remember most, like rideshare, like medical marijuana, like nurse staffing, are the people you meet along the way. Very often we're working with people who, have jobs every day and something that isn't politics. And along comes a ballot question. And then we need to ask them to be active, to maybe tell their story, to step out of their comfort space. And so I think the opportunity to organize, like during the course of that campaign for 4 years, we talked to over 38,000 drivers in multiple different languages with dozens of organizers. And you start to learn something along the way, and it changes the way you look at an industry. Certainly on nurse staffing, when we had thousands of nurses on the no side of that ballot question talking about why this wasn't going to work, and they took it upon themselves to get active. Watching that activation is just wonderful. So I think Conor would probably agree, it's really watching people get involved in these things that, they never thought they'd do politics before. And that's really wonderful to see and be a part of.
And it gives them kind of an up-close look at the sausage making, not necessarily on Beacon Hill, right? I mean, sometimes there is behind the scenes, but really out there talking to voters, right?
Yes, and they make up their own ways to campaign, which is really interesting. And they find different ways to reach voters. And I know, we're going to talk about what makes a successful ballot campaign, but I think the things that make these such rich experiences and such learning experiences are the people that take action, that have never taken action before, that become empowered, that will go out and talk to friends and neighbors about what's at stake, put up that lawn sign, stand on a street corner at a farmer's market and talk to voters. It's really exciting.
Yeah, I would add that there were a ton of drivers that reached out to us after the settlement was announced, and they were like, "This is great, but now what do I do?" Like they were so pumped. They were going out, they were doing press conferences, they were doing rallies, and they got really into it. And they would text us and say, "What? Is there another issue I can get involved in?" And I think that speaks to your point.
I wanted to ask about, kind of zooming out a little bit, how things have changed in terms of the campaign side over the last 15 years, and especially the last 6. Conor, you and I were talking about before we got on this panel about the pandemic. So we've got pre-pandemic, the pandemic, and then post-pandemic. Can you touch a little bit on that?
I would say, pre-pandemic, it was just kind of standard, I guess. The election cycles weren't that dissimilar. I mean, there were the changes that we've seen in media and in my realm, but pandemic accelerated those so much, and doing a ballot question during the pandemic was a very odd experience. And Steve was making a comment when we were chatting before about all the different debates you have to do for these things, and everything was virtual in 2020. In terms of the biggest shift in the post-pandemic world, it's on the media side, which is what I see every day. The change in how you get your message out on the owned side in particular. Earned is earned still, we're losing reporters like anything else, but I can't tell you how many fewer outlets are doing editorial board meetings, are taking op-eds. I mean, I lost count of how many ed board meetings we did in 2018. We have 2 scheduled right now for this election cycle, and we've been calling newspapers, and they're all saying, we'll let you know if we decide to do one, or no, we're not doing them anymore. And op-ed's the same thing. It's, the Globe still does them, Mass Live, a handful of others, but the opportunities to get third-party advocates out there talking about your issue have dramatically gone away.
We'll get to the media in a minute, but Lynda, talk a little bit about what you've seen change and modify over the years.
Well, I'm always asking Conor, how can we do more editorial boards? Why aren't we in the editorial boards? And he's the first one to say, things have really shifted. I think when I really first started in this business, and I think you'd probably say the same thing, a lot of people thought, there's an issue, there's a question on the ballot, we're just going to run some ads, maybe do some earned media for 3 months, and then that's enough. And I think what I've seen change is, and it's what I spoke to earlier, I think it's the activation of people around the issues. And I look at ranked choice voting right here as an example of that. People come to these issues, get active, and it's social media, it's earned media, it's research. These are small businesses very often that we're creating to solve problems sometimes people didn't even know they had. Right? Like who knew we needed medicinal marijuana at the time? Like some patients thought it was important, and then we had to talk to a bunch of people, 2.8, 3.2 million voters about why it's important. And I think over time, these ballot questions became not an afterthought, but a full campaign of engagement with elected officials, community groups, community leaders, and the grassroots. And, I think about ranked choice voting during the pandemic. Now, that didn't work out in 2020, and that could probably be because during the pandemic, it was hard to convince people that ranked choice voting was a solution to a problem that they needed to solve. And so, and the pandemic certainly has changed things, but, now we can get on Zoom and talk to people that way. People are used to convening in different areas in different ways. But I think for me, it's become, how do you have a more broad campaign and really take time to activate people? It's not just an afterthought. It's a year-long process of engaging stakeholders. You become a better campaign, and you tell a better story, and you have better participation when you make it more broad.
What's the effect of having a presidential election on the ballot at the same time? I mean, we're in the New Hampshire media market. There's an overlap. Lynda, what kind of effect does a presidential race have on the ballot?
Well, I think it's interesting because what tends to happen is people are watching a lot of things on TV that have nothing to do with, the 4 or 5 questions that they might ultimately see, when they get their red book in the mail and start to investigate. So I think for a ballot question, you have to have a really good storyteller to break through, because there's a lot of back and forth noise. If you listen to and watch TV, it's Kelly Ayotte is great, Kelly Ayotte is terrible, Joyce Craig is great, Joyce Craig is terrible, and then so on and other issues. And it really puts a premium on finding someone who can tell a personal story about what's at stake come November, about this thing called the ballot question that isn't just sort of a bunch of words on a page. It's about someone's life. And it will impact other people's lives. And that's the storytelling involved. And I think it makes us do our jobs better by finding those stories that really resonate, that really stick with people, because they have so much incoming now. And it takes something off the plate around turnout. Anyone who's involved in campaigns, you can kind of tell who's going to come out and vote. We know voter history is a great indicator of their participation moving forward. And so the turnout is coming. So it leaves you in a case of persuasion and reminding people to vote the full ballot.
And when you go back and look historically, presidential election years, there tend to be fewer or no ballot questions. I went and looked, there was none in 2004, there were none in 1984. There were only 2 or 3 in 2000, 2 or 3, or we had 3, I guess, in 2016. So it's generally fewer because of that noise, because of it's harder. Opposed to driving people out, you've got to convince the people that are already coming out when they're not paying attention. One thing is interesting when you look back at the history, the Secretary of State's website does a nice job of pulling this out, is there used to be a much higher percentage of blank ballot questions than there are now. So we've essentially had ballot questions in mass for 100 years. The first 50 years, the average was 30% blanks. That's down to 10%. Over the last 50 years, they're only getting 4 to 5% blanks now. So people are voting on the ballot questions at a much higher rate than they used to. But that's just because they're just not leaving blanks, right? They're just, not necessarily making informed decisions, maybe because of the red book, which is interesting enough, also came to be because of a ballot question. But I think it's the presidential noise it drives people out, but doesn't necessarily help the messaging around the question.
So I wanted to come back to the media part, and Conor, you and I have talked about editorial endorsements, how I personally feel about them as a political reporter. Yeah. I'm kind of annoyed by the concept, but what impact do they play as a third-party validator? And then also kind of how do endorsements in general affect, Governor Charlie Baker coming out for the charter school question didn't help at all.
Well, I'll let Lynda speak to that one. But generally what they're very useful for is for messaging. Right, to spotlight in advertisements, to say, endorsed by 50 organizations, endorsed by the Boston Globe, and that's really the biggest value. I mean, on its face, an editorial is probably not going to persuade that many people, but it is a validation to the way people are probably already leaning. And then when you emphasize that, and when you're educating voters, and you can have a press conference, and you could say, that's why this question has been endorsed by this mayor and that mayor, that as a cumulative does certainly help.
I think that's right. I think, I think we've won things without key endorsements. People would say key, and then we've won things with them. And I think it's how you run the campaign. And, voters are funny. They will look for information. If there's a nurse staffing question, they're going to ask a nurse. If there's a question on charter schools, they're going to talk to a teacher. And so I think as we got better running fuller campaigns and engaging more people in the process, we had more mini messengers out there for people to talk to. So those endorsements are almost as important as the bigger endorsements. But this is what voters do. They get the guide. There's a lot of information that suggests they'll start Googling and looking around. They certainly want to look at pro and con statements from the campaign, but they're also looking for other things to look at, other resources. So, and I think, smart campaigns tell a good story and work very hard to get as many endorsements as possible and to share those with people so they can find them. But, for some other campaigns, it may be that you have the endorsement of, 20,000 teachers, and maybe that's better than not having an endorsement of something else.
I was thinking too about kind of a voter seeking out the information in the most recent primary. Obviously, the ballot questions are in November, but the primary features some fairly obscure posts, and I could see Commonwealth Beacon getting a surge in Google search traffic where people were looking up, like, all right, what does an SJC clerk do for Suffolk County, stuff like that. So voters are going out there and they're trying to find out what the issues are and who these folks are. I wanted to kind of touch on I think you've both worked on the yes side and the no side of ballot questions, right? So what are the challenges on either side of that? And is there anything that can make or break either a yes campaign or a no campaign?
In my experience, no is an easier side to be on. Generally speaking, people only need one reason to vote no, and they often need to be convinced to vote yes if it's not an issue they're passionate about. That being said, I've won and lost on both sides. So that has always been my approach. Our approach is that no is easier. If you can make 10 arguments against a question, you really only need one to resonate with somebody for them to be like, oh yeah, I'm not voting for that because of X. Versus, boy, I really want to support this, but this is making me nervous here, this one piece of it. So from that perspective, I've always viewed it to be a little bit easier to work from no. I also think because of that, you have to start from a higher place on the yes side in terms of you got to be polling high 60s, low 70s to even have a viable campaign, knowing that you're going to get a lot of no votes from people that don't know or are not interested.
I think that's right. I think in terms of what I think about, when we start a ballot question, certainly understanding which side you're on is important. And there are opportunities on both sides, but, there is some conventional wisdom that says it's a little bit easier on the no side. But I think for me, that just means you have to work harder on the yes side. And that's the opportunity to grow and have a more vibrant campaign. I think one of the things that is really important, and I think maybe not overlooked, but I don't think it's talked about a lot, is who is the group behind the yes or no side that you're with? Is it a cohesive group? Have you learned how to work together, how to disagree and agree, how to move forward, make decisions? I mean, campaigns are quirky things, right? They have deadlines. There's no, can I hand in my paper late? There's no extension. The election happens and that's it. There are unforgiving deadlines in terms of submitting your ballot question. There are unforgiving amounts of signatures that you have to collect. There are rules. They must be followed. And I think having a core group that really, they don't have to agree on everything, but you need to learn how to disagree and move along and make decisions and follow the research. So I think that's a really primary important part before we start any of these. We want to know who's together, how do you work, and how can we get things done?
I sympathize on the deadlines, for sure, especially dealing with daily deadlines or weekly deadlines. So I want to touch on something that may be a factor. I don't know. I was going back through notes on another topic, and I stumbled upon my notes from interviewing the Boston election commissioner in 2012, which was medical marijuana, I think was on the ballot. She was complaining about the length of the ballot, saying like, well, she was encouraging voters, like, go in with a cheat sheet. Yes, you get 5 minutes to vote in your booth there, but go in and come in prepared. Is ballot length a factor, Lynda?
Well, sometimes, what's also interesting is that there are other questions for other municipalities. So it's not just the entire ballot, from president on down, and then the statewide ballot questions. There are also these other questions. So very often we'll spend a lot of time talking to local clerks about how long the ballot is. And so sometimes you're in a position on a campaign where you're like, don't forget to vote page 2 and flip it over. So sometimes there are very specific instructions for very specific municipalities because there are other things going on. And yes, you'll see this if you stand back at a polling location. You will see people come in with their phone, with their red book, perhaps a cheat sheet. People really do their work, and they come in prepared to vote. And then I think Conor mentioned this. It used to be a lot of people used to skip the questions, and now you're seeing more and more participation. And I think that's because of the voter guide and because there's more and more ways to find and access information, digitally and through neighbors and otherwise.
And I talked about some of the challenges and opportunities that have shrunk. I neglected to mention the Tufts Center for State Policy Analysis, which emerged in 2020, just randomly in the pandemic year, not because of the pandemic. But these reports that Ben and his team do, I think, are extremely helpful for voters in terms of presenting what the question would do, and here's what the pro side says, here's what the no side says. So to your point earlier, again, I'd love to know what kind of web traffic he gets in the run-up to Election Day. Are people actually, I hope that people are taking advantage of these reports because I think they're very well done.
I'll make sure to ask him next time we're on the phone. Next question actually submitted by one of our crew here. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about ballot questions? Or what do you wish the public knew about how ballot questions function? Lynda, you want to go first?
Sometimes in our work, some campaign people are like, oh, I don't want to work on those because they're not as interesting as a candidate campaign. And I think they're fascinating. Again, because of the different people you meet and the way that you get to know an industry or an issue, you really can kind of deep dive and get to know something. So I do think they're fascinating. So oftentimes when you go into a focus group situation with voters and you show them some of these ballot questions, like, wait, why are we doing this? So I think sometimes there's that hurdle of, why are we deciding about this? But I do think they're an important part of the way that we make change. I mean, we need to have different tools, whether it's the legislature, whether it's ballot questions, whether it's the elections, to kind of make change. And I see them as part of this. But yeah, I think those are the things that kind of come up for me.
I would say to voters, for anyone that likes to complain about the State House or likes to complain about the state of our democracy, hey, right here we have a way for you to change things. You just need a lot of elbow grease and some friends with money helps, but there is a way for voters to do it. And I think I mentioned this to you again, but we think like this year, oh geez, we've got 5 questions. That's a lot. Are we shifting more towards this? We actually used to do a ton more. There were a lot of years where there were 8, 9 questions back in the 70s up to 2000. There were 8 questions, and we haven't had more. This is the most we've had since then. And it's fascinating when you look back and see how often we used to try and change the Constitution, let alone just try and pass a law. And so this option is out there for voters, for anyone who wants to change the law. And that's, I think, the biggest misconception is they think this is just government as usual when it's actually the furthest thing from that.
I think you were, Lynda, you were telling me about the camaraderie too, right? I mean, I guess that's maybe not a misconception, but certainly the camaraderie that's built even between opposing sides.
Well, it is interesting. It's sort of like a primary, you end up going to all the same community forums together. Very often you have friends that you meet along the way. And I think one of your next guests in the podcast to follow, he tells a story about, over the course of the one ballot question, he would go with the other side, the guy who did the other side, and they'd commute together, because you do end up together on these things. Yeah, it's fascinating.
So our focus has been looking back at the ballot questions. The next panel, which will be available as a sister episode of the horse race, they're looking forward to the current cycle. But I did want to ask, because you're both experts and you're both here, what's your view of what the future holds? And that can be either specific, medical marijuana being kind of viewed as a stepping stone to full-on legalization, or just also generally.
I think we're going to see more questions. I think there are a lot of things that people are seeking change at the State House. And, every year I think there are 8,000 bills filed and, they go through the process and they do their best to tackle the ones that they can. But there's plenty of stuff they're not going to be able to get to. And, I think about question 4 on the psychedelics. That's something that, a bunch of legislators up there were pushing. It was making its way through, but it wasn't moving fast enough for advocates. And so that this tool allows folks to maybe speed things up along a continuum of getting things closer to the voters to get done. And I think it's just another tool, and I think we'll see more of them. I hope we do, because I think they're an interesting way to engage people, and I've enjoyed this work. I mean, it's maybe a plug for more work, but I do think it's important. There are a lot of things that need tackling. There are a lot of ways to approach these different things, and some of them can be solved through this method.
Okay.
We'll see more questions that increasingly tackle niche issues, the kinds of things that are hard to push through the State House. When you look back, things we used to vote on, the death penalty, handguns, abortion, taxes, lots of questions about taxes. And, now we've got things that don't necessarily impact everybody. And I think we'll see more of that going forward.
Conor, Lynda, thank you so much for being here and joining me on the Codcast. Thanks to listeners at home, and thanks to our special live audience here at Boston's West End Museum. I'm Gintautas Dumcius, and our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Please stay tuned for The Horse Race, where Jennifer Smith, Steve Cazella, and Steve Crawford will talk about the dynamics playing out this cycle. Thank you.
Thank you.